tranquilo, já pode começar, tá bom?
Tá.
Obrigado, Carlinhos. Vamos lá. Ok, vamos lá. Acho que já pode, né?
Já.
So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm so glad today because I have two colleagues here to talk to us, to all of us here, in a very interesting dialogue here. So, first one, Brian Morgan. Brian Morgan is an emeritus faculty member of the English department at Glendon College, York University in Toronto, Canada. His research interests include critical approaches in English language teaching and language teacher education. He's the co-editor of the Critical Language and Literacy Studies series published by Multilingual Matters and a current member of the Board of Trustees for the Center for Applied Linguistics. Since 2011, he has partnered with Brazilian applied linguistics on several research projects and publications, such as Ruberval and Claudia. Ruberval Maciel holds a master's degree in applied linguistics, University of Reading, UK, and a doctorate from the University of São Paulo, USP, Brazil, with a study period at the University of Manitoba, Canada. He was a visiting researcher for Fulbright at the PhD program in urban education, City University of New York, and a postdoctoral researcher at the Universidad Nacional de Jujuy, Argentina. He's a funded researcher for the Brazilian Science and Technology Research Council and a lecturer at the Letters and Medicine undergraduate and graduate programs. His research interests include new literacies, translanguaging, transculturalism, and teacher education. So today we're going to do something slightly different from last week. We have some questions here, and the idea is that we can talk about them. So our guests will try to answer these questions and we can talk. All right? So I'll start with the first question. Both you, Brian, and Ruberval, well, you know, one of the acts of the Brazilian government of Jair Bolsonaro in 2019 was a national literacy policy, Política Nacional de Alfabetização, that prioritized the phonics, you know, a shorthand for approaches to teaching, reading, and writing that focus on sounding out words, so associating phonemes with their corresponding graphemes. So you know that this approach worked together with, I mean, global or whole word approaches, but the idea, the supporters of phonics are opponents of all other approaches to literacy, those associated with Paulo Freire, you know that. So in this national literacy policy, they use the word literacies and not letramentos. I'm sorry, literacias. The translation from literacies, they use literacias and not letramentos. A word that has been used in Brazil over the past 30 years. So considering the current Brazilian context, how do you see this back to basic movement as a site of resistance or possible appropriation of literacy teaching?
Maybe I should let Ruberval respond first because he's more familiar with the context.
Okay, so yeah, I think this literacy wars has always been there for a long time, not just this period here. And we've seen that this part of when you have a new government, you have new policies being launched. And sometimes those policies are not synonyms of innovations or change in education. So in this sense, I think these educational policies have become synonyms of educational policy changes that we might call fast policy making. This is something that we've discussed, some years ago. And educational professionals sometimes become skeptical of the reforms and less committed. And I think that going back to the basics and this sort of policy that tries to avoid the use of critique, the word gênero in Portuguese, and so many others that they try to avoid. This is also part of this philosophy of this government. And even for us, I think we have to listen other voices, not just from the university, because I think we have discussed some of these issues at the university and also at some associations. And what we see at the end are some cartas de repúdio. And I don't know how far, if those initiatives of trying to resist from, those documents are really efficient, because we need to see also the voices of those teachers that sometimes they don't know, even when we were trying to discuss issues related to literacies, letramentos, critical literacies, multiliteracies, and sometimes those themes were a bit far from the realities of those teachers as well. I think it's difficult to have to see the both sides, the very traditional ones and the ones that we have, tried to implement in the last few years. I feel very sad because, after so many years of discussing Freire, we have to go back again to those old basics. But I think this is not just here in Brazil. It's a phenomenon that has been all over the world. For example, when I talk about Australia, for example, the literacy wars, and in the US and so many other parts of the world, I think this is also a movement that is part of an agenda of the government. And this is something that, this government said that was going to do when they would be in power, for example. And I think that here we have to think about the epistemology of the complexity. How can we see this from a more complex way of not just one theory or the other theories, but the other things that are involved in this process, and all those philosophies and ideologies that they are also they say that they are avoiding ideologies, but again they implement another ideology that is this here. So the thing is, I think is how can we resist from, and what are our limits to resist as well? I don't know what Brian can add on this, because I'm just trying to complexify the context that is not just here in Brazil, and the limits of the academia, for example, in trying to find spaces to resist and show other alternatives.
Well, I completely agree with Ruberval's point that there's a subtext on one hand to the reimposition of basics, phonics instruction, rote learning, decontextualize in terms of social context the nature of reading. And I do think that on one hand, it is a cover for the rise of conservative, populist, nationalist politics. Certainly in the United States, it's quite frightening to think that there are now state legislatures that are banning books. It reminds me of the 1930s of fascism in Europe, where and maybe in earlier times in Brazil too, that anything, and actually banning the notion of critical race theory by legislators who don't even understand what it is, who never read it. But it's you see this kind of merging of political ideologies attaching themselves to certain kinds of policy decisions, which they don't understand. But it's part of especially in this, and this is emerging in Canada too, in a slight way too. So you see a more polarized society, and literacy becomes the front line of many different cultural contact points of conflict. So so on the one hand, this is a key issue. But there's other interesting things involved too. So I'm always, and maybe Petrilson and Ruberval can help me. The word alphabétisation, is that equivalent to literacia's orientation, or entirely different? Alphabétisation, or is that I know that's opposite or different from letramentos.
Yes.
Would it be considered equal to or in similar to the idea of literacy as a more traditional?
Yeah, more traditional idea of literacy.
Yeah.
Meaning literacy.
Yeah. So it's interesting with going back to rote learning. There's things about rote learning though that fascinate me, because I rote learning and memorization, rote learning, this kind of oral recitation of text. One of the things that fascinates me is I'm interested in how teachers, going back to this problem of how do teachers engage with policy in a critical way. So I found this experience originally. I'll get to my Chinese experience. So and I've always been interested in how can teachers learn how to read policy, such as this policy, in ways that enables the teachers at a local level to either mitigate, mediate, supplement, resist, in ways that demonstrates their agency. So in 2007, Vaidehi Ramanathan and I co-edited a special issue of the TESOL Quarterly, and the whole theme was on policy enactments. And the interesting thing I always found is that when I was doing teacher ed on literacies and pedagogies, especially in second languages, most students, and maybe your students feel this too, would feel that policy's has nothing to do with me. This is what people in government do, or this is what administrators do. So they didn't understand the fact that a policy becomes real in this engagement in enactment. It is really the role of the teacher. And so that, I mean, certainly there's constraints on the teacher. There may be like work pressures, all sorts of pressures, but the teacher has a tremendous amount of let's say, agency, local agency to work around, or even, I would even offer to appropriate, critically appropriate things like rote learning, if they have the imagination and the encouragement from their language teacher educators to do so, I think. And I found that experience from teaching Chinese students, both in China and working my first job coming back from China in a Chinese community center. So there were often times in which I would find ways in which traditional Chinese literacies, which are very much about memorization and literacy, you have to learn 5,000 characters to just function with text. And you have to learn them in the strict order of strokes that that there could be ways in which this kind of approach to text, this unique approach to text, could be used in a very kind of critical transformative way. And so there was some of the things that I worked on in my PhD dissertation about that. So the key thing is about how can we, under the context of policy that we know is wrong for our students, work around it, supplement it, complement it. Can we find ways in which things like grammar instruction, things that we say are not really in a Freirean way, opening up, reading the word, can we take that word and that traditional methodology of rote learning and infuse it with the critical potential? So that's always fascinated me. I'll turn over to you guys.
Yeah.
I can just complement maybe what Brian mentioned about, this idea of how teachers read those documents and how they react. I haven't read, many things about, the reactions of teachers about, those curriculum. And going back to the literacy studies, I think one of the things that is important to raise here is, in relation to how teachers react to those documents, as Brian mentioned, is about maybe critical literacy about language policies. So this is something I think is interesting to discuss, for example, and this critical literacy of language policy would focus on the study of language policies, for example, and teacher education is committed without investigating how they are implemented. So this is one of the things that I think is the lack of one of the implementations of either a more critical or this kind of curriculum. So so many of them are introduced without the commitment of how to investigate how they are implemented, negotiated, resisted, or even reconceptualizing according to their local and contextual knowledge. Because I think we have discussed here from our context here, because of our beliefs, because of our background. And I think it's interesting to bring also other voices to the ground as well, to see, because when we introduce other curriculum, for example, some of them, they were skeptical. So again, as Brian Morgan mentioned, because for some of them, they are there just to implement the curriculum. And sometimes those implementations are just about what they have done, for a long time. And when they close doors, they do differently. So how they are, I don't know if you know, some other experience, for example, for the, some of you that are attending here. So how they are resisting, for example, those imposed curriculum that is more related to alfabetização or literacia.
Great.
From their perspectives.
Okay. The second question we have thought of is, what are the new or emerging priorities in relation to language, teacher education, and critical multiliteracies? In 10 seconds. I'm kidding. May I repeat it?
Sure.
What are the new or emerging priorities in relation to language, teacher education, and critical multiliteracies?
Well, that's a good question. My first thought about it is, and having worked with Ruberval and a little bit with Petrilson and Claudia over the years, is to what extent can we say that there is a common set of priorities across our two settings? And Ruberval and I have also worked and had experience in Cuba. So again, it goes back to, giving teachers a sense that someone isn't going to give them the magic list of here's the priorities.
Mhm.
That teachers need to develop a sense of and a responsibility to their particular setting. So the priorities in one setting for language teacher education might not be the same in another. And this was actually going back to my, I mean, now that I'm retired, I can reflect on my very first job. Was my whole thesis dissertation was, oh my gosh, that I'm teaching at this Chinese community center downtown, where the reasons the students come here and the language needs they have are not going to be the same in another community center, even another neighborhood in the city. And I'm starting to learn that I had to make decisions rather than saying there is a best method and a common core. It was my responsibility to become informed of other options. And I think the one theorist to me still to this date who's been the biggest influence in this line of thinking was Kumar Vadavelu, or Kumar for short. Mm-hmm. Because he was the one that said you begin with three principles. He talked about three principles of particularity, your local situation. He talked about you begin from there. You look at practicality. So the core is practice. What does, in a sense, it's kind of a Freudian idea of praxis, is that the theory must emerge with the practice in the setting. And then what are the possibilities? So I know that the panel talks about transformation. Kumar was in some ways a pragmatist. What are the possibilities for this group of people in this setting at this time to enact some of the goals that we think are important for either community or academic or familial, family, ethno-linguistic community life. So then he said, okay, why don't we have macro strategies? So instead of saying there's a best method, his approach was, and I still think it's the best one, is that why not have a whole repertoire from which we can borrow from? So instead of saying we've learned which was the old progressivist model, and of course that really came out of, and he talked about epistemic dependencies in the coloniality of language teaching. It was very much part of Kumar's work. Colonialism of English language teaching. He said, why not have a repertoire of strategies and understandings to draw upon, and to, through negotiation with students and collaboration with students, implement in a particular setting. And I still think that model is good. I mean, one of the interesting arguments for me is, let's say, the Hanchier model, where the teacher does not provide any, or the teacher relies on the student to generate their own practices, or the Kumar model, where I mean, there's two options here, that the teacher realizes that it is not their place to impose a set of methods, versus what does the new teacher need in terms of a repertoire from which to choose and reflect or critique. So what is the better approach? I tend to think that the model that Kumar says is that you should have, let's say, a group, a set of strategies, a repertoire from which to choose what's locally appropriate has been my favorite, rather than not offering any kind of methodological or strategic or literacy-based kinds of tactics.
I think it's a challenge to focus on some emerging priority, or choose some priorities. And, you know, according to Brian mentioned, Kuma and Rancher and some others. But we have seen, for example, nowadays are some curriculum based on competencies. And when we see those curriculum focused on competence, sometimes the priority for implementers are just, you know, seeing the 10 main competences or the main competence for the 7th grade or those other kind of things. And I think that what Brian mentioned based on Kuma, they are important here because I think they are, it's difficult to say this is important or this is the priority. For example, when we talk about strategies, for example, or competences, in this case, it's easier, I think, for the teacher and for curriculum makers how to say this is the priority, this is for this, for the 4 first years, and you know these are the priority for the rest, for example. And also in terms of multiliteracies, we've been criticized as well, and also, for example, Luke has mentioned the idea of disposition as also something important for the curriculum. So this shouldn't be, you know, a list of priority, but maybe we can focus on disposition. But then if you focus on this disposition, the critical aspect, for example, we go from one point to the other point. And this is the thing, you know, how can you have a balance of the, you know, for example, in terms of methodology and also in terms of disposition that look, you know, more recently brings, I think Brian can add more about disposition here as well. So I think they could be intertwined, you know, those ideas of disposition and methodologies here. And in terms of micro strategies or critical disposition or best practices. So I think that it has to be local again, as Brian mentioned about, you know, the possibilities according to some context. Maybe you can add more about disposition, Brian.
Yeah, sorry.
You know, those criticism about, you know, the multiliteracy movement.
Yeah, so that it's a fascinating. Ruberval is hit right on the head of the pendulum swinging from one critical emphasis to another, and in part this is generated from the pressures of academic life. It tends, by the time it ever reaches down into the classrooms, who knows? But yeah, so the New London group in 1996, of which Alan Luke, Bill Cope and Mary Clancis, Courtney Kasdan, several others, were very interested in what were and Gunther Kress, I think, was part of that group too. We're very interested in the implications of new digital technologies, and what would they require for as we were reaching the millennium, what would be the curricular requirements to bring students and teachers up to this kind of needs of texts that were no longer print-based, but included everything from screen work, movement space, all sorts of meaning-making resources. And they came up with, and again, to me reminds a little bit of Kumar, they came up with the idea of a toolkit. Toolkit. So again, this idea of not just, because we had the tyranny of methodology for a long time. I was completely immersed in it, that the only way you could teach was you had to do strong forms of communicative language teaching when I was trained. It was even worse. We used to fine students for using their first language. And it was terrible. And also we used to, the supervisors would warn you against teaching grammar. And this is in the 1980s. You were not allowed to teach grammar because theoretically it was thought to intrude or get in the way of a natural acquisitional second language capacity that we cognitively had. So we would always go through these trends that there was a best method, and if you didn't follow it, you were cheating your students and you were ineffective. So I'm trying to get off on this train of thought. So the multiliteracies group were really, this was an innovation. New London group said, no, we need a toolkit that the new digital world demanded a kind of pluralism of techniques to match a pluralism of facts. And they also said students needed a rigorous, not just anything goes, but there should be an equally rigorous, principled approach to reading texts that were multimodal texts that matched the kinds of literacies that we had prior to this new developmental stage. So innovative. And Gunther Kress in particular took it to another stage where he and Theo van Leuven implemented a visual grammar borrowing from social semiotics and Michael Halliday's notions of functional social grammar as opposed to a Chomskyan internal grammar. So anyway, so it was a really interesting formalized approach, principled, requiring students to develop a meta language, a language to talk about texts that went across media. Recently, I know Ruberval and I talked about this. We were working on a paper with Ian Martin, and the two things happened. Luke wrote a couple of papers commenting on how this kind of reading had become appropriated for non-critical purposes. Mm-hmm. And he gave the example how very conservative authoritarian governments really like the idea of critical thinking. Mm-hmm. So the question was, if you focus too much on tools and you forget to talk about tools for what and for whom, mm-hmm. and you can easily become kind of taken over by the very forces and social forces that you were trying to challenge. And so he recognized this. And no better claim to this is that how many business schools have critical thinking programs that look at digital literacies and multimodality. And even if you look at the emergence of what's going on in the internet in terms of reactionary types of literacy practices and right-wing literacy practices online, you start to see that the best intentions can be taken over by elements of society that are against the kinds of principles of equality and egalitarianism that we talk about. So two things that Luke started to realize is that you need to be nimble. Is the way, I don't know how that translates, nimble. You need to have a flexibility. And instead of standing behind a set of defined literacy skills and calling them critical multiliteracies, maybe you need to instill in teachers this ability to evolve for changing sociopolitical conditions. And so this idea of dispositions, instead of teaching a set of critical methods, reading practices, or curricular, you need to teach them how to have this kind of critical awareness of understanding of the shifting terrain of oppression, the shifting terrain of authoritarian policies and political things, and then respond accordingly, which goes back to what we said earlier in the last question. You respond by learning how, for these students in this place, what are the options that I have? And then also dispositions is to learn how to read how your own beliefs, how your own values have been shaped by the same social milieu, the same environment in which you are trying to work towards change. So an ability to look at yourself and to begin looking at ways of strategically challenging rather than teaching a fixed set of practices. So so dispositions, this is a challenge. This to me is identity work. What are the teacher education practices that instill in new teachers or existing teachers an awareness of their agency, an awareness of their subjectivity, and by that I mean awareness of how they are also culturally, socially, politically inscribed, and inscribed by language. And so make them aware of, there's the term to be reflect on this reflexivity as important as technique. So Luke posed a really, I thought, was a critical question for us. And so where should we lie? So instead of saying on the pendulum that Ruberval is talking about, I think it's where you come in at what place. Who are the students? Are they student teachers? What's the setting? That I think you need both the identity work, the dispositions, but also some set of tools to work with. Because sometimes you need the tools. If you don't have them, you don't know even where to begin to critique. That was my own experience. Mm-hmm. If I hadn't been so immersed in communicative language teaching before I went to China, I wouldn't have even known I wouldn't even begin to understand the ideologies behind particular methods. So you almost need something to stand against. It's like when you need post-structuralism, but you need to know structuralism before you can have post-structuralism. You need to know coloniality before you can have decoloniality. You can't work in a vacuum. You need to know liberalism, in other words, to understand neoliberalism, or you're lost. That would be my comment on that. So I still think it's good to have some kind of grounding in something that you'll later reject, where you won't know understand why you're rejecting it.
Okay.
Very great, Brian Ruberval.
Okay.
My apologies to the designer. I must be speaking really quickly.
It's okay. Great.
Sorry. Desculpe.
Okay, so the third question is, what are the strengths and weaknesses of translanguaging in support of practices of resistance and decolonial initiatives and epistemologies?
Well, Ruberval, you've done a lot of work in this area. Maybe I'll let you start, because I know you've especially worked with Ophelia Garcia on this.
I think that I'm a bit suspect to talk about translanguaging, but I'll try to talk about both sides. This is the idea. So I think that this is a term that has emerged, from the Welsh context in 2012. And just to mention some numbers here, that there is one paper that Ophelia Garcia has just published in March 2022. She mentioned that there are almost 23,000 published work on translanguaging after almost a decade. This is a huge number of publication to this field. And I was looking up in the Google Acadêmico here in Brazil, there are about 544 publications. So this is quite recent. So I remember when we were discussing in this room with Suresh Kanagaraj in 2014, I think, that was the beginning of this conversation there at Unicamp. And many people were asking us, especially Claudia and I, so why are you talking about translanguaging in a monolingual country? So this was, the beginning of some criticism about the translanguaging perspective here. But I think that translanguage opens space for, to understand, for example, the dynamic multilingualism of students taught by dominant language. And I think that has problematize, for example, addictive bilingualism. And after some years, we have introduced some other things related to translanguage as a decolonial project as well. Because in the beginning, there was this discussion of translanguaging and code switching, basically, you know, the difference of these two terms. But then there are some other issues that emerged from this spirit. And I think that if you ask me, so why are we studying translanguaging, for example? I think it has to do with social justice, because we are talking about repertoires, for example, and not just language 1, language 2, or language 3, or, you know, whatever. So we're talking about repertoires. So we have here in Brazil a big movement of refugees, immigrants here. So this is a challenge for a school. So we have to consider those repertoires. So we have to include those students. So there is also this necessity for social justice as well, cognitive justice, because those students are come to school, they have a repertoire, they have knowledge, they have to be validated. We have to assess them differently, for example. So this is, you know, that we have discussed from the translingual lenses, for example. Decolonization is another thing that we have discussed, for example, to open us the space, for example, to discuss the context of bilingual schools in the borders. So how those students are treated in the borders, for example, in the borders here in Brazil, for example, in my case here, the borders of Brazil and Bolivia, the borders of Brazil and Paraguay, and how those philosophies and those ideologies of colonialism are still there. So, and how can the teachers or the students can transgress, for example, and how their identities can be included in the curriculum. So also we have introduced some other concepts, for example, from Kanagaraja, such as spatial repertoires, not just linguistic repertoire, but expanded to spatial repertoires, for example. And we have many other colleagues from sign languages that were interested in translanguage because it's more dynamic, you know, it is fluid, it works with the flow. So there are some works with deaf languages, for example, for sign languages that were interested in translanguage to include these other repertoires, especially spatial repertoire and less Cartesian lenses to understand languages. And there is one thing that I agree, for example, with Bell Hooks. There is one of her quotation that is, she says, multiculturalism is currently in focus in our society, especially in education. But there are not many practical discussions about how the classroom context could be transformed to make learning an inclusive experience. And I think that this is the challenge. So how can you bring more practical issues to bilingualism, to sign languages, to consider, other views of text, for example, expand the view of text and include, for example, spatial repertoires. So these are the things that are the strengths of translanguaging, for example. And it's not just, again, a way of looking to language in terms of code switching or translanguaging. It can be if you analyze one interaction, for example, it can be code switching and it can also be translanguage, but it depends on your lenses in this case here, because if you're just thinking about in terms of named languages, it can be code switching or translanguaging. But if you expand this analysis, for example, including spatial repertoires and other things, for example, if you are including those students, because we're not just shifting from one language to the other, because we're using, for example, the students' repertoires. So you are using the context, the other things of meaning making, or expanding ways of meaning making. So then we understand that this is not just a simple strategy of shifted from one language to the other. So maybe to be more didactic, so we can talk about translanguaging in 4 main aspects. For example, the first is to transcend, the borders between named languages. As some would compare translanguage code switching. But if you talked about, you know, a decolonization aspect of this theory, for example, I think it opens space to recognize, you know, the dynamic multilingualism of students taught by dominant languages, right? And how they feel in those contexts. And then we have started problematize again this addictive bilingualism, and we have also considered more the aspect of dynamic bilingualism. So in this case, I think one of the strengths to talk about in this first aspect here would be to empower both teachers and students also to transform power relations and focus on teaching and learning processes, enhancing the experience of meaning making. So it's more than just considering, you know, code switching, for example, in this first aspect. The second aspect, we could say that translanguage could be related to when translanguage, for example, transcends the verbal resources and consider other semiotic resources. For example, this is very visible, for example, when we're talking about sign languages, for example, or, you know, this communication that is not just in the syntax of the language, for example, or when we are analyzing visual aspects, that it is not just the image itself, but there's this whole context that we are talking about, for example, assemblage, you know, not just the you know, the multiple semioses involved. You know, the second would be to transcend the notions of the linguistics, but also include the semiotic aspect. The third would be it transcends the notion of text and context, because we traditionally analyze a text, and this text was in one specific context. So in this case here, the third would be text and context are not dissociated, and also including other temporal aspects of meaning making as well. So in this case, we would include assemblage, we would include spatial repertoire, we could use other metaphoric, for example, body without organs, that is from philosophy. So there are many ways of looking to this. There's the notion of corriente that Ofelia Garcia says that you don't know when one language starts and when the other language continues. And the fourth would be translanguage in terms of transformation. And this transformation would be very much related to the decolonial perspective. So transformation more related to decolonization, social justice. So I would say that's a new transformative and transdisciplinary paradigms that enables the creation of the new logic and realities. And I've used this, for example, also with medical students. So I think I've mentioned here before, you know, this relationship of medical students, and then we go to another disciplinary field, and translanguage has to do with more transdisciplinary, but also bringing other issues of affect as well, not just in terms of the linguistic, the semiotic, but also affective repertoire to the ground. So I'll stop here and then go to Brian, and then maybe later you can talk about the experience with translanguage in medical context.
Okay, that's a lot there. That's great. So I'll just go through some of my own experiences. I mean, the first experience with what translanguaging offers was in my context of adult education and my interest in citizenship and critical citizenship. So just like Ruberval was saying about the individuals' repertoires not being recognized, I used to be so frustrated that the curricular that I was trained at, the curricula and the acquisition principles I was trained under, said that students needed to reach needed maximum exposure in the target language, and that they weren't able to handle cognitively difficult, but in fact intrinsically motivating content because of their limitations in second language. And so right away I would watch students in their group. So I'd be doing group or watching them basically translanguaging, because this was a group of adults living in Toronto who came to this community center because it was a Chinese community center. They didn't come to learn how to go grocery shopping because all their grocery stores spoke Chinese or Vietnamese. They didn't come to learn how to talk to their doctor. A lot of them were seniors, I have to say, because their doctors spoke Chinese and their banks had that. But they were so keen to come and learn and learn about ideas and learn about this new country. So what I started to see is that they were all translanguaging. They were not going to talk about survival language skills, or they would stop coming to class. They were there to have meaningful, serious adult conversations about their new society. And so right away, it started to make me realize by this curricular obsession, and of course, the problem here is that it was a national curriculum. This failure to recognize that teaching in downtown Toronto is going to be different than teaching in rural Manitoba to adult immigrants or refugees. And so you started to see again, the teacher needed to supplement the policy, translanguaging, encouraging first language use, even in advanced level classes, was crucial, because students needed the ability to talk about things maybe in their first language that were important to them as a basis to begin to want to struggle with them in a second language. And that was again my earlier work in the idea of community-based language teaching, that sometimes content, meaningful community-based content, should take priority over some kind of theories of target language acquisition. So that was one of the things that right away I started doing a lot of teaching where students' first language, and again, I'm using named languages because for the identities of these students, named languages were really important to them. And again, these students had been raised in a very kind of rote learning, memorization, literacy, forms of literacy orientation of strict character stroke orders and things like that, and also very interesting kind of choral recitation. They were trained, many of these older students, in reciting passages and memorizing poems and aphorisms and repeating them out loud. So getting to something that Ruberval said at the end, that it was so interesting to me, and as I've started to realize, even in my own reflecting on my own literacies or languages autobiography, is that these practices are also deeply effective. They're not just ways of learning a language. They also have, they call up the practices again of memorization, rote learning are especially for minority communities in a place like Canada, United States. These literacies themselves bind communities. They create a kind of sense of who we are, where we came from, and also the historical reasons why we came to Canada. So this idea of post-memory, the intergeneration, is tied to this kind of, and so I became really interested in Toronto, signs that what I would call transsemiotic. I became really interested in the semiotics of affect, and how particular signs would integrate scripts or even calligraphy qualities or orthography, script qualities of other languages and how the text itself was speaking to different audiences in different ways. So this idea of that Ruberval just read of an assemblage is that there would be the unit of analysis of the text was not the same for everyone viewing it. So there's this notion of what's called, from he was mentioning Deleuze, of distributed addressivity, or that's also Bakhtin, that the same text in a public place, and especially in a place like a city like Toronto, probably also Sao Paulo, the same text would be saying different things to different audiences. And it would be at different levels of meaning. It could be just like denotation, a proposition saying, like I wrote about this in the paper, this is a bagel store. On what level? It just says bagel world. On another level, the same, there'll be characters implied for a particular readership that has a feeling of authenticity to what's on offer. And for others, depending on your background and your own literacy practices, it would bring up historical memories of why am I here? And there's so much of this in Toronto. You see, and again, this idea of spatial repertoires, how in a certain public place, these signs are serving multiple purposes, reminding people of their ethno-linguistic background, but also implying a sense of, on another level, commercial authenticity. Come to this neighborhood, it's very cool, it's very Greek, it's very Chinese. And then also just simple instrumental, this is what we're offering here. So
the
this
idea
kind
of chronotope as well, right?
What's that?
Chronotope, just to add in.
Yes, that's right. So the chronotope, yes.
Yeah.
And so I became fascinated about this. And so like when Ruberval says this idea of an assemblage, so that when you read the text, the unit of analysis, you can see includes the materiality of the signs used, but also of the position of the different positions of different viewers. And it's been very interesting how the politics of sign usage in contemporary times increasingly does this. You'll see it becomes infused text with little insignia from other languages that are used to rhetorically to say bad things about one's opponents, to implicitly say negative things about particular communities in society. And so this is a whole area where I agree with, there's a guy named Rutherford who wrote about how politics and societies moved from the marketplace of ideas to the marketplace of signs. And I think this is so true. So, and this is where schools and universities are so off the mark. We are so tuned into training students to produce evidence-based argumentation. You know, when I teach academic writing, on reason, rationality, and that the best argument will rise above the others. Where in the world of politics right now, there's a lot of anger, anti-intellectualism going on, polarizing, and the kinds of signs that they're and forms of communication are not conforming to academic standards of text making. So as a teacher, you wonder, am I really preparing my students for the world outside the classroom if that's all I'm teaching? I don't think so. So these kinds of rhetorical strategies infused with translanguaging, transsemiotics, the politics of affect are very much part of the world in which students are moving into, rather than the world of reason, rationality, and Toulmin's argumentative writing structures. So in some ways, academic writings, we're out of touch.
Just to add some other examples in what Brian mentioned, I think that for in our context here that we were supposed to be monolingual country, this was the first criticism we had when we started discussing translanguaging here. But I think after a while, when we talk about the colonization of language, and we discuss with teachers, I think they understand from the lenses of translanguaging, for example, some other ideologies that we've, implement, or for example, some ideologies of English only, no Portuguese here, for example, English only zone, for example, in some other contexts, that we used to do this here in the past, for example, when we sort of implemented communicative approach, for example. We're not aware of those other theories, because those second language acquisition theories, they were very much focused in one specific ideology or monolingual orientation. In this case here, for example, in some questions that many English teacher mentioned, for example, you know what, you don't know why you don't learn English, because you don't think in English, for example. All those ideologies that, if you don't think in English because you are using Portuguese in the classroom. And so when we started using other theories, for example, the translanguage lenses, I think they sort of understood, those ideologies that we used to reproduce here. And also in terms of social justice, for example, just to mention another context not related to English, for example, in the border of Brazil and Bolivia, for example, this is very common in borders here in Brazil or any other borders, but more specific in Brazil, for example, when mothers have to, for example, the Bolivian mothers or the Paraguayan mothers are pregnant and they have to deliver their babies, they come to Brazil, they have their babies here, and they go back to just cross the street and go back to their countries. And when the kids are about 5 or 6, they come back to school with a monolingual orientation and monolingual curriculum. And again, I think we found there's 2 works that I've supervised comparing the borders. And the teachers transgressed, this was the one only teacher there that used to transgress the local rules and started using translanguage. And we saw very visible how the students were learning more, in the process of literacy, learning Portuguese, for example, in terms of social justice and cognitive justice, and other with sign languages, for example. I remember when we started this project trying to implement a translingual pedagogy for sign languages as well in science, that is not in English or in any other language, that was a science class. So there were 3 students there. So when they come to class, they came with their interpreters. Everybody greeted the interpreter, not the students. And then when they used their repertoires in sign languages and started explaining, for example, photosynthesis in Portuguese using sign languages, what happens that, most of the classes were bilingual at the end, because they had to negotiate meaning. And this is one thing that I think translanguage is important, is the emphasis on meaning making. That, that meaning is not ready, it's not there, it's not stable. So, and the teacher understood, for example, how to deal with meaning making, for example, with those deaf students, and also the relationship with the deaf students with the other students changed completely. So we see, some practical experience in terms of social justice and cognitive justice, and the way the teachers also assess those students were different. But if you don't work with them, if you don't deconstruct this idea of what is language, the ideology, behind the language and so on and so forth, I think this has to do in the beginning. And the other thing that is related to the fourth item about translanguage, more related to transformation and transdisciplinarity, was when we brought also the issues of affect. And this is something that I've done with Brian and Anwar. We have discussed using dual ethnography and three ethnography. And when I started introducing translanguaging, in terms of meaning making to medical students, for example, I think I also expanded their notions of repertoires, their communicative repertoires with their patients, including affective and spatial repertoires, because what they had there was just the word communication, the communications between doctor and patients, but we had to deconstruct this idea of just communication per se and introduce other aspects of meaning making and also spatial repertoires, affective repertoires. And for me, it was a movement of displacement with my safe house, because it's difficult when you leave your, our, let's say, main academic domain and starting working with other colleagues. I think how to make meaning with others, with other professionals, for example, and what is the role of translanguage in that space. So for me, it was a kind of disposition and displacement as well, this experience with them. And also the opportunity to reflect the idea or the concept of literacies, for example, and a space to analyze, for example, how students perceive affect and how they treat their patients, since, but this is something that I've developed with Brian, since the concept of affect from Spinoza and some others. I don't know if you want to talk about this in relation to translanguage and the affective, from a linguistic turn to an affective turn. And do you see any relationship with translanguage as well in this specific discussion, Brian?
Well, I want to go back to something you said. The stepping out of your safe zone, you said.
Yeah.
So now, was that in the context of working with the doctors or working with us in the context of the duo ethnography or true ethnography, or is it both?
In both.
Okay, yeah. So
yeah, because it takes a long time to write this kind of text.
So the way, that's right. And what I see as common across them is that they both really want to take you outside of your comfort zones. So both the nature of duoethnography and the example, which I thought was such an excellent example, is working with doctors whose identities are so tied to a very European, Eurocentric model of the expert. The expert who knows, the expert who identifies, and the expert whose relationship to a patient is very transactional. Tell me what your problem is and I will prescribe the medicine or the surgical solution. And then what was so interesting is that Ruberval's work introduces another level that is actually probably more intrinsic important, is this dimension of feeling, that we're not just bodies built up of chemical, biochemical elements, that we are also built up of feelings, which are part of that respond to and create those biochemical things. So the fascinating thing is that doctors are not trained. We're evolving. So there's going back to the chronotope and how things evolve. You actually have doctors now that are more skilled in this whole area of what kind of medicine is it called? Gosh, I can't believe I forgot the name. But naturopathic medicines, holistic medicines, where feeling the materiality of the body's chemical and organs are seen as directly related to one's feelings, and one's feelings are directly related to one's relationships to the world around them. Both so an ecological transformative idea. So the fascinating thing about this is that we don't train doctors that way. And bringing in a translanguaging kind of component was fascinating. And so I could see it reminds me of how I used to feel as an ESP teacher working with working in fields I know nothing about, so working with an accountant or a doctor or an engineer. It was the same kind of thing. So yeah, so that was fascinating, and I really loved that activity. But again, that is such an important element of that. So you've got the parallel of stepping outside, and this is actually a question more for Ruberval, not maybe at that moment, but has that experience of the trio ethnography and duo ethnographies changed how we do our work with our students? So if you're not familiar with duo ethnography, someone's going, I can see someone going like this. Someone's getting a lot of camera action over there. She's naturally attractive. The camera is focused. Yeah, so it's interesting to think. I like duo ethnography they're not easy to do. They take time. They ask you to question your beliefs or to suspend them. It places emotion. I think we felt with Anwar and with Claudio, what makes them really important for any talk of emotion is that it's an emotionally challenging or fraught environment, because you're asked to be sincere about your ideas and to be open to listening to others challenge them. So right away, that's like a tightrope for an academic, because we are so invested in our ideas that to listen to someone tell us something different can be, it's not always often a good thing. So those are the aspirations. So the other thing that's fascinating about it, there's another layer of perhaps coloniality involved, and it's the hierarchy of disciplines. To get published, to have career success, you have to communicate in a certain way and write in a certain way. And you have to quote certain disciplines that are fashionable. And if you don't, the editors and the reviewers send your papers back, and it can be not good for your career. So you've got this added level of pressure. On one level, you're trying to challenge epistemic or dependencies, but that you're often forced to write in ways that almost reassert a different level of colonialism. So the quality of the texts you produce to challenge colonialism reassert it in other ways that ignore. For example, when you do a trio ethnography, you are trying to reproduce a sense of orality, of oralcy. And if you really look at the history of literacies, oralcy was around for thousands of years longer than any kind of text encoding or orthographic, pictographic, ideographic encoding. And so how does oralcy translate history? And meaning is often through this kind of interpersonal oral emphasis, the way in which the body and the relation, and this gets lost in a lot of writing. A lot of writing is very abstract, and students will look at you and go, what the heck did this mean? But when you sit down and have the kind of conversations that we have, and you tape them and you try to work them into your, it's not perfect, but in a sense, in some ways, we've lost what I think is essential to teaching. Language teaching, to me, what separates it from other disciplines is the centrality, the core relationship of interpersonal contact and negotiation. And in that sense, it makes this unique. And so we have to be careful when we do transdisciplinary work that we don't lose what's essential or what is unique about our field, because we're too busy bowing to to the hierarchy of university disciplines that make the university more money and prestige and higher rankings. So, and I think that's encoded in how we write. We have to be careful about that. That's another reason why I like the duo ethnography, if it's done right, in a sense, aspires to the kind of interpersonal dialogue and relationships and the sincerity and openness of them that universities, to me, crush in the way they rank and measure and do things. So
great.
How did I get there?
Great.
Well, speaking of rhizomes.
Yeah.
Well, I have a last question for you two. You both talked about, effective politics. And how do you both think the rise of effective politics such as negationism, white supremacy, conspiracy theories, how this effective politics might create sites for critical pedagogists? This effective politics in social media. How do you both see this?
Well, I'll let. I still think the affective politics in Brazil will be different than the ones that we're encountering now in Canada. That'll be
surely.
the first thing. So I can speak a little to what's happening in Canada. But
Right.
Go ahead, Ruberval.
Yeah, maybe you can start, with the idea of body in this, to talk about affect, right? That there's not affect without the body. This is one of the things that is very important to the affective theory and to talk about affective politics or the circuits of affect, to bring the idea of body to the discussion, because this is something that was, when we were talking about the more rationalistic view of language, the body, the affect, did not have much space in this. So I think it has been neglected, in our recurrent and rationalistic understanding of language, practice, and the road. I think this is something that we have discussed, we were talking about the affective turn, before, talking more specifically about what Petrilson mentioned about the politics of affect. I think that it's important to find a place to discuss affect in language theories. And obviously we have to go to other fields such as philosophy, for example, to cultural studies, to other authors that have discussed affect, since Spinoza, for example. So how can we affect and be affected? And more recently, for example, Safatli talking about the circuits of affected here. And I think this is something that we've done in that work with Anwar, that was published in the Revista Caleidoscópio. That was one specific issue for the 30 anos da ALAB in Brazil. So I think we have to talk about affect, again, in terms not from a rationalistic view, but more from an affective view. So, for example, just basic questions, for example, what can you see, for example, in this picture, but in how do you feel this picture, and why do you feel this picture, or why, how do you feel this video, for example, and why do you feel this video, start off questioning things. And these are the things that we have discussed in critical affective theory. So I think that this is one thing that we've started discussing with Anwar, but there is much more to be discussed and to be written about the role of affect, not in terms of affect, in terms of emotion, but in terms of how we are affect, how can we affect, and how can we be affected, and why are we affected by, those things in related to the politics, for example. And more recently, I think not just in Brazil, but in many places, sometimes we tend to use our rational argument to discuss with people about one specific thing. But because I think this is not and we have seen that we don't agree to each other, in terms of political differences, for example. And we try to explain people, about fake news, about other things, for example. And sometimes not through the rationalistic explanation that we get there. I think they are this circuit of effect that Safatli says that there is much more to be discussed in terms of effect rather than the rationalistic view. And we don't have many tools sometimes to analyze affect in language studies in general, because we have sometimes very strict or categories to analyze many things related to language, for example, from the multimodality, from the translingual, from many other, from the discursive, but from the affective aspect, sometimes it's difficult to capture, and sometimes you cannot capture, those analysis. But I'm try to say that affect is something that we have to discuss. This is new. We have to talk about to talk in dialogue with other disciplines. And may I go back to you, and then I go back to affect in language teaching later on. Can you go further, Brian?
Yeah, the point you raised about there are, up until now, no clear tools to analyze and teach affect. It's really true. It's or they're very superficial. Where they say, "How do you feel? Happy, sad?" There'll even be like in early ESL text, you check. I feel there'll be a happy face or a sad face and something. Yeah. So the article that we worked on with Anwar, and Anwar has a fabulous, under another name, Anwar Rudin has a fabulous article on critical affective literacies, where he does lay out 4 key principles of that. And in our paper, we did each provide an example of how we tried to introduce a dimension of affect into our teaching. And so maybe affect isn't like a curricular item that you teach, that there's like a clearly marked beginning and end in the syllabus where you learn it this week and then you're done and you move on to item number 2. I mean, that's one of the that's the other problem about identity work in general, is that you don't teach it in incremental, discrete units of knowledge, and that the time scale of learning about this, we talked about time scales and chronotopes. The time scale in places where the lesson is learned can be much later. That it's like we used the term in another paper we call aha moments, where the realization of what that lesson was about and my reception of it and my embodiment of it might happen a year later. Oh, so that's what Brian was trying to say. So now I get it, what Ruberval is saying about teaching medicine. So the structure of schooling doesn't really conform to some of the most important lessons or meta lessons of identity work and affective work. So the example I gave was working with a student in one of my classes, a graduate student, Stephanie, who was doing an assignment, I call it issues analysis project in language teacher education or graduate studies. And the project is identify an ideological gap or problem in the discipline and design an intervention or blueprint to resolve it. And that blueprint could be, it has to be discipline specific. It's related to the sphere of your professional life. So it could be in the form of a set of materials, a workshop. It could be in a policy statement. It could be in a website for others. So it's the way in which we produce texts that will make your voice heard by colleagues. So she picked up on what was called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Indigenous Peoples in Canada, which was relatively new. And it highlighted the history of colonial white settler oppression for Indigenous people. And it also lays out calls for action. One of the calls for action, there's about 70 of them, asks for how we teach newcomers, immigrants, about Indigenous history. Fascinating. So her brilliant insight is she started to look at what are the main books we give new immigrants and refugees about Canada. So they're coming to Canada. What is the image of Indigenous people we give them? And she very astutely looked at the main texts used to say, affectively, we teach students to feel nothing about them, which was such an interesting insight. Is that in these textbooks, and this was my upbringing, I grew up in Saskatchewan, one of the largest Indigenous populations of Canada. It reminds me a bit of Mato Grosso do Sul, that there's large Indigenous reserves in parts of the province. Invisible in my textbooks, almost nothing about them. And the only images you got were of drug and alcohol abuse, overrepresented in the criminal system, nothing of ecological wisdom, nothing about how they were able to survive for thousands of years, of political systems, of cultural, none of that. What are we taught to feel about the Indigenous people? She read the books. We were taught to feel nothing. So her whole project was looking at, as a white settler woman in Canada, working as a teacher educator, what would a workshop look like to introduce other new teachers about the realities of Indigenous history? Brilliant. And she looked at it from, again, I asked her questions about this idea of affect. And she talked about her own affect, the lack of understanding and the need for empathy and the oppressive history of white settler society on Indigenous people. So it was a brilliant project. And I was real happy to see that she got this paper. She took the project and got it published as a journal article. And she's gone, and even better than the publication, she's actually gone out to conferences presenting it, working with teachers about this serious gap that's tied to affect. Because we act on, like Ruberval was saying, this idea of affectus, being affected and affecting others, is a highly mobilizing and politically powerful part of our society. We respond. Otherwise, we stay home and do nothing. We're close to nothing. So I thought that was a really interesting, practical example of the kind of theory we were talking about in a very pedagogical, education-oriented way.
So, great. Many thanks, Brian Ruberval. Well, unfortunately, he's 3:30, 31, actually.
Right.
Yeah, and we, our translators here
Are getting tired.
I think we're right on time now to finish. But yeah, I
they
think
can.
we can.
How about questions from the students?
Yeah. I think we can now, Hannah e Fernando, nós teremos que encerrar aí agora, como é que é?
Pois então, depende do que vocês combinaram com o contratante, na verdade.
Foi, não
né?
foi diretamente de vocês, né? Que a Cláudia, foi que a Cláudia, né? Que ela tinha
Isso.
falado com a gente, foi 1h30, né? Não é isso?
Then feel free to follow as you want.
Oh, it's okay. So, you have one more question?
A gente pode estender
Yeah.
uns 10 minutinhos
Ah.
mais. A couple of minutes more, okay?
Time for a last question, okay.
So I have a question for you both. Hello. So do you think that translanguaging can be considered as potentially complicit with elite multilingualism, between commas, and the neoliberal cooptation of multi/pluri-language practices?
I think in some settings, yes. I know that some universities, I think particularly in Europe, which has a long tradition of plurilingualism and multilingualism, that universities do sell this idea of global citizenship as a kind of upper class elite undertaking is tied to at least the surface features of having multiple languages as part of your repertoire. And so, yes, I think there is that danger that you can having multiple languages doesn't necessarily translate into empowerment or egalitarian or equality or social justice. It can easily be appropriated or used as a kind of gatekeeping to elite professions that are very privileged. So that, I mean, I think, so my answer is, I think, yes, there is, just like we were saying earlier with multiliteracies being appropriated, you do see, even in my university now, they sell the idea of multiple languages, again, as part of this kind of global elite youth culture. And it doesn't really look at what are the responsibilities of being in that elite. What are the social responsibilities? There was a fabulous article by my colleague Stephanie Vandrick called she called it Teaching Songs, SONGE, and it's Students of the New Global Elite. And she looked very much at this issue of this kind of unique, globally mobile, privileged class of students, many coming from very authoritarian societies that were already moving into elite practices, and parts of the display of their elite status was, again, their multilingual translanguaging orientation. So very interesting.
Great.
Yeah, I would say it depends. Again, there is not a single definition of translanguaging. I think it depends on how where the critique comes from, you know, because I tried to mention here at least 4 ways of looking to translanguage, although they are not separate. But I agree with Brian. But it also this critique also applies to other theories, for example, multimodality that Brian has just mentioned, for example, for critical literacy, that there's some critique that where is the space for the language or language proficiency, or it depends on the work that the teacher does in the classroom. So in this case, I think it depends on the context. If you're just considering translanguage in terms of named languages in this context, more European context that or American context, that there are those critiques. On the other hand, if you talk about social inclusion, for example, if you're talking about cognitive justice, if you're talking about, I think we have to think about translanguage beyond the named language, or not just named languages. So I think that as any other theory, translanguage has limitation and has strengths. So it depends where the context applies. But and some are considering translanguage just in terms of named language. So I think it again, it can apply, but it depends on the context. But I think more strengths than weaknesses related to translanguaging.
Great.
Okay.
Brian, do I see behind you your violin case? Is that right?
That's a guitar.
Yeah, it's a
That's a guitar case.
Would you play for us just to finish this a little bit?
No, I'll save that for my next trip. I'm sure there's another question or two.
Right. All right. So, well, we unfortunately, I think we have to finish, but I'd like to thank you very much, Brian and Ruberval. It's a very interesting conversation. That's the point. I mean, I think you answered questions brilliantly, and I think it was a very good point for all of us. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Petrilson, Marcia, Cloud, and all the others that are organizing this conference. It's always a pleasure to discuss here themes that we have.
I'd also like to thank Hannah and Fernando for translation.
Yeah.
It's very good. I mean, and we're talking out here about inclusion, no? So it's something to. Well, thank you very much.
Okay.
And I hope Brian and Ruberval, next time you both be here so you can finish by playing the guitar and singing maybe next time, right?
Yeah.
So see you guys. So bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.